Thank you, Nir, for coming on the podcast and taking the time today. I really appreciate it. You are the best-selling author of a couple of books. The first one is called Hooked: How to Build Habit-Forming Products, and then Indistractable: How to Control Your Attention and Choose Your Life. Both really interesting books on seemingly sort of opposing but very much related, subjects. And in addition to writing, you're also writing on a blog, nirandfar.com, pretty prolifically there, and then also doing some angel investing and consulting and public speaking and things like that. But I think the best place to get started would be for those who don't know you, maybe haven't read your books, to sort of tell your story from as early as you're willing to start to where you are today and talk about some of the decisions you've made along the way.
Sure. So thanks for having me on, Jake. My story is that I'm a behavioral designer. So in my professional career, I help companies design the kind of products and services that people use because they want to, not because they have to. So I work with a lot of companies in healthcare, getting people to take their medication, or fitness apps to get people to work out, education products to help form habits around learning a new language, for example, or excelling in school. So all kinds of products that require repeat behavior. There's so many products and services out there, enterprise, consumer web, that are wonderful, but fall flat, or the company goes out of business because people don't use these products that would really benefit them. So that's what I do professionally, is I help companies design behaviors through the products that their consumers use. And that's what my first book, Hooked: How to Build Habit-Forming Products, is all about. And then I also am a father, and I'm also someone who struggles with distraction, which is what led me to my second book, Indistractable: How to Control Your Attention and Choose Your Life. And the premise of that book is, if Hooked was about how do we build good habits, Indistractable is about how do we break bad habits. Not to the same things. So they're not opposing books. They're quite complementary. We can build good habits with that fitness app or that language learning app. We want to do that. But then we also want to break the bad habits around the distractions in our life, like too much news, too much booze, too much football, too much Facebook, whatever you're having too much of that you might be habituated to in a way that's not serving you and rather is hurting you. That's what Indistractable is all about. It's about reclaiming your attention so that you can have the life you desire. And so that's my subject area. I've been working in this for over a decade and a half now. You asked, what's the origin story? Where did it all start for me? And I would say that it probably began, my interest in behavioral design began when I was a middle schooler, and I was severely obese. Like not just chubby, like full out obese. I remember my mom taking me to the doctor's office, and the doctor saying, "All right, son, you see this chart up here? This is normal weight. This is overweight. And here you're in this red zone, you're obese." And I remember feeling like food controlled me. And it wasn't until I spent a lot of time trying to figure out why it felt like food controlled me that I stopped actually blaming the food. And I realized at some point in my life that I wasn't eating because food was delicious. Anybody who's overweight and really is honest with themselves and others, we're not obese because food tastes good. We're overweight because we eat our feelings. And that's what I discovered, is that I was eating not because I was hungry. I was eating because I was lonely. I was eating because I was bored. I was eating because I felt a ton of guilt and shame about how much I had just eaten. And so it wasn't until I really focused on what today I call internal triggers that I could regain control over my weight and eventually my life. And so that's kind of been a consistent theme around how products influence us and how we can fight back so that we can get the best out of these products without letting them get the best of us.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's this obesity epidemic in the US and maybe other countries, I'm not too sure, but people sort of wonder what that could be attributed to. Some people talk about like, all these processed foods, and maybe it's like sugar or seed oil or whatever it might be. And I don't really know enough to have an opinion, but the concept of sort of eating your feelings and stress eating and things like this, or boredom, whatever, depression, eating for all of these sort of feeling related reasons is not novel. But hearing you talk about it is sort of the first time I've actually connected, like maybe this, obesity issue in the US is actually first and foremost not a result of, food systems or sugar or seed oils or processed foods or whatever it might be, although it very well may, but it may be that at least a contributing factor, if not perhaps the primary factor, is actually, issues of loneliness, issues of stress, sort of societal issues that go beyond the actual food system that are contributing to this problem. and I'm not sure, but it's a possibility, I suppose. I'm curious, given that this was sort of your first experience with uh, a real issue that you sort of tried to overcome related to feelings, very much related to, behavioral design work that you do today. What was your actual experience of overcoming the obesity issue as a kid? Was it, an identity thing? Was it learning to sort of navigate some of these feelings? How did you, before you were really doing any of this professionally or anything like that, just in your amateur ability to sort of overcome that issue? Obviously you did. How did you do it?
Yeah, so it is a lifelong struggle. So I still, today I'm in the best shape of my life at 45 years old. For the first time in my life, I have a six pack. I've never in my life had one. And I'm not saying that to brag. I'm not saying that to say I'm athletic. I'm not athletic. I'm probably one of the least coordinated people you'll ever meet because I never played sports as a kid. But I figured out a way to get into the kind of shape I want and to have the kind of health, physical health I want in terms of the factors I can control by becoming indistractable. That's really what it's all about. It's about intention. It's about doing what you say you will do. And it's not easy. I'm not saying it's simple. Everything in life worth having is worth putting effort into, and none of it can just be found in a magic pill or some kind of easy solution. But I would say that it's interesting that obesity is kind of a great example of behavioral design and how we can take steps to have agency as individuals. I would think if you ask me on the list of suspects as to why there is an obesity crisis in the United States, I would say that it's probably not seed oils. That's probably least last on my list. It probably is, I would say, number one, first and foremost, the number one culprit for obesity in America is the motor vehicle. It's the car. That when you design an environment where you move, you expend calories and you spend less time eating because you're spending more time moving. I grew up in a suburb of Orlando, Florida, where we had no public transportation, where if we wanted to go somewhere, I had to wait for my mom and dad to drive me somewhere. This was before the days of the internet, so life was pretty darn boring. And what did you do? You watched TV and you channel surfed, and I ate Twinkies and Cheetos all day because there was nothing else to do. You couldn't walk anywhere. And when you look at obesity rates in cities where people, around the world, if you look at the great cities of the world where they have, what we call a 15-minute city, where everything that you need is within a 15-minute walk, you have much lower rates of obesity because the environment is designed to promote a healthier lifestyle. So I think that's number one. And then I think number two is access to abundant calories. Now, that's not the food industry's fault. I think capitalism did a marvelous job of, for the first time in human history, we don't have mass famine anymore. I mean, this is amazing. Think about it. For 200,000 years of human history, famine was a regular part of the human equation, right? That millions of people would starve to death because of crop failures or whatnot. Well, capitalism cured that problem by and large. I mean, today, if we have a famine, it's because of political instability. It's not because of a shortage of calories. We have more than enough calories to feed every man, woman, and child on the face of the earth. Today, we have the problem of an overabundance of calories, right? We have diseases of excess like obesity, like diabetes, that these diseases were pretty unheard of when you're in a caloric shortage. And so the price of all that progress, the price of progress is that we have to learn how to deal with this abundance, right? We can't shake our fists at the food companies and say, how dare you make delicious food? That's their job. We want them to make delicious food. Now, of course, within reason, I am for legislation that protects children, for example. But for the most part, I don't want to ban Twinkies. I don't want to ban Krispy Kreme. It's delicious, right? I want to eat those things if that's my choice. So I think the price of progress is that even if an environment is designed to promote a certain behavior, it's up to us as individuals to understand that fact and counteract those designs and that abundance to make sure that it doesn't get the best of us. So you can not only can you design an environment to promote certain behaviors, and it's no coincidence that I choose to live in cities because today I think I walked 13,000 steps just going to meetings and living my life, right? I didn't have to go exercise, especially. I choose to live in a designed environment to have that. Not everybody could, live in a city, but certainly you can take steps quite literally to have those kind of routines in your life. And so that's the kind of active effort we might have to make to make sure that we keep our life in balance when we live in an age of such abundance.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that especially with COVID a couple of years ago and still sort of staying with us a bit in certain ways, certain defaults that have sort of been flipped in society. I think there's a big opportunity for you know, the designs of where we live and where we work and how we live and how we work to be changed quite a bit over the sort of the course of this decade and beyond. I sort of think that the implications of COVID and the resulting shift to a lot of people, especially like sort of knowledge workers working primarily remotely, I think that's, I'm sort of optimistic at least that that's sort of yet to really play out. Like we're still only, a few years removed from this. And I know for me personally, like I, started my career, I lived in San Francisco and then New York, and then COVID hit and sort of moved home for a while, lived with my family, traveled and stayed for months long at Airbnbs, which is something I never would have done, if I had to be in an office. And then now, decided to move to sort of just outside of Miami because basically, there's a lot of sort of people, like-minded people moving down here, but for a bunch of reasons, the weather's great, whatever. And I don't need to live in the city because I don't work in the city. So I live just outside of it in like this sort of, very nice place where I can walk to get my groceries. I can walk to get coffee. I can walk to everything. So I take a car like once a week to, go to downtown Miami or whatever it is. And it just changes the way that you live. You don't have to, you're not taking the subway to work and taxi to meetings. And so you can sort of, you can exercise deliberately, but your exercise is sort of integrated into your daily life. And I think, environmental design. And then of course you do have sort of choices that you still need to make. Like you could live in New York, but take subways and Ubers everywhere. You are obviously, choosing to walk to meetings instead, which obviously serves you greatly, at least in the fitness, dimension. So I think it's sort of this combination of designing your environment and then realizing the choices available to your environment or in your environment and sort of taking advantage of those. And obviously this sort of translates beyond just where you live and exercise and things like this, but also to, how you design the apps on your phone and on your computer and your workplace and things like this. Are there places or rather sort of realms beyond, living in a city, sort of other key categories that you think about in terms of environmental design where you've been very deliberate about sort of how you set your life up?
So certainly when it comes to technology and media, I'm very deliberate. So I was a few years ago before I wrote Indistractable, I was really struggling with this problem of distraction. I would constantly find myself doing everything but the thing I said I was going to do. And that was having some real consequences, right? It was having a consequence with my health because I wasn't exercising when I said I would. I wasn't eating what I said I would. I was becoming distracted when I was with my family. I would start checking my phone when I was with my daughter and doing a lot of things that really embarrassed me now that I look back at it, because I wasn't living the kind of life I know I was capable of. I was constantly distracted. And so I think that is another price of progress. I think, again, like, we hear a lot of critics saying that technology is hijacking our brains, that it's stealing our focus. And it's not stealing or hijacking anything. We are giving it away. And so the price of having, just like we are so lucky to live in an age where we have an abundance of food. I mean, does anybody stop and think about how amazing this age is, that we have an abundance of calories, we have an abundance of information, we have an abundance of entertainment options. There's so much to be thankful for. But of course, there's a price for everything. As Sophocles, the Greek philosopher, said, nothing vast enters the life of mortals without a curse. And so, of course, there's going to be a price to be paid, right? The price of having an abundance of calories is that we have to learn how to eat right and exercise. Sorry, it's a fact of life. We have to learn. If it's the price of having the world's information at your fingertips and being able to connect with people all over the world. You're in Miami, I'm in Singapore. We're talking right now for free through a magic video screen that neither of us could actually explain how it works. That's magic, man. That's amazing. We live in the future right now. And so the price of all that is that, yeah, we have to learn how to use this stuff appropriately. And so that's what Indistractable is about. It's not for people who are very comfortable whining and complaining about how the world is out to get them. It's for people who say, yeah, I want to use these technologies in a way that helps me, that serves me, as opposed to me serving it. Again, not that it's easy. It's certainly not easy, but if we just sit and shake our fists at big tech, we're not going to get anywhere. So I've certainly designed my life in many unorthodox ways to make sure that I stay indistractable. And so that's what, it took me over 5 years to write the book Indistractable and develop this model. It took me 5 years because I kept getting distracted. And that's why it took me so long to write the book. But when I really went to the fundamentals, the first principles around the research around why we get distracted, I learned that the truth is much more empowering than I originally thought. It's not as simple as saying, "Oh, just stop using your phone." That's really crappy advice. But it turns out that the deeper reasons, back to those internal triggers, turns out to be something that we actually can do something about if we know the right tactics and strategies.
Yeah, I think there's sort of a few different elements of that I love. One is sort of this, very positive and optimistic view on the world. This is the best time ever to be alive. I personally subscribe to that, but certain people you can always find problems if you're looking for problems as to why this is, a bad time or things are getting
Yeah.
worse or whatever. And I
And
just
you
don't think
sound
it's
smart.
productive.
That's the biggest problem, is that people who are optimistic sound uninformed, even though I find that people who are optimistic are actually the most informed, right? Because the shallow media feeds you a narrative of everything's terrible, because that's how they make money, right? Cable news and traditional media, their message is Chicken Little. Chicken Little is a great business. The sky is falling. That sells newspapers. That gets people to tune in. Nobody has headlines that say, how many people were saved today from curable diseases or how many airplanes didn't crash. No, they talk about all the terrible things that are happening in the world. And frankly, people in my industry, in the tech field, who talk about how terrible tech is and how awful it is for one reason or another, they sound smart, they sound informed. But if you really look into it, if you go past the surface level analysis, you realize actually things are getting better and better.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And so, beyond the positive and the optimistic, it's also the sort of opposite of this, victimhood mindset where you're saying like, hey, look, yeah, there's these technologies. Yeah, they can be used for bad or can sort of be using us if you let them. But the key word is like, you let them, like you do have control at the end of the day. I mean, you can delete the app, you can take extremes if you want, but maybe there's sort of more in between options that you can do as well to just sort of, for example, like I have sort of a love-hate relationship with Twitter. I try to manage it the best I can. If I really wanted to, I could just delete it. And, after, a few weeks of having it deleted, I'm sure I wouldn't miss it very much or whatever. But I choose to engage with it because there's a ton of very positive things that I sort of find from Twitter. I get awesome information. I can follow people I'm interested in. I can meet interesting people, et cetera, et cetera. So I think
Yeah.
that's just a very productive way to view the world. I want to go deep on Indistractable and some of sort of the actionable pieces of that, and maybe talk about some sort of tangential questions related to the process that hopefully, you haven't covered before for people to, listen to. But just before we do that, you mentioned sort of writing the book for yourself in a way and taking 5 years, having to sort of battle distractions along the way. I'm curious, how your writing process sort of developed through that, to the extent that you have various pieces of the process that are sort of consistent, or
Mm.
principles for going about it. And then it doesn't even necessarily be like where you ended up through writing the book, but even where you are now and writing for, on the blog, sort of your latest
Yeah.
and greatest version of sort of best practices and things that work for you. Of course, it's personal, but things that have worked very well for you for writing as prolifically as you have over the years.
Sure. Yeah. Happy to share everything I work on. So I'm a completely open book. So for me, I write books that I need. I don't set out to write a book about something I know about, because that sounds hella boring. Why would I want to write a book about something I already know? I want to write about something I want to know. So when I needed a book about how do you build habit forming products, and I couldn't find any book that taught me that, I started doing research to write it for myself. And when I found that I was very distractible, and I looked out there, and all the books that I found said, "Oh, put away your technology, stop using tech, and stop stop checking email so much, written by, college professors with tenure. Well, thanks a lot. I'm going to get fired if I don't use my technology. It's nice to say if you have tenure and you're not going to get fired, but that's stupid advice, right? Like, stop using your technology is really dumb because most people don't have that luxury. And even if they do, why would they want to, right? You don't have to stop using Twitter completely. You can find ways to moderate your use so that you use it in a way that is beneficial. And it's awesome. I mean, we connected over what? Instagram, I think, right? Like, we reached out to each other. So, there's so many tools out there that really can enhance our lives if we lean into using them in a way that serves us. And that's what being Indistractable is all about. But for me, it wasn't until I discovered these methods for myself that worked for me. So for me, when I write a book, it can't just be about personal anecdotes. When you read self-help, personal advice type books, they tend to fall into these categories of, very little research, more personal anecdote, almost like autobiographical type stuff. This has worked for me, so it's going to work for you. That's nice, but that's not good enough for me. That I also want some of the research. And this is where the other genre, sometimes you get very academic books, which are very interesting from an academic perspective, but not very practical. So in what I write, I want practical advice that's also based on really good research. And, sidebar, there's a lot of really crappy research out there. We've seen with the replication crisis in the social sciences, how bad some of these studies are. Unfortunately, every day we hear about another fraud incident or a study that was done really poorly. So my job is really to give people actionable advice that's based on really good research. So there's 30 pages of citations in each of my books to peer-reviewed studies. So for me, that's the kind of advice that I really trust and believe in. Is not only is it something that worked for me personally, but also something that's backed by solid research. So that's what I enjoy reading, and that's what I enjoy most writing. And the goal is always to scratch my own itch. And if other people like it, I'm super blessed that my books have sold over 1 million copies. I'm thrilled that other people find it helpful. But if I'm really honest with you, I write the books for me.
Makes sense. I think that's a great way to go about it. I know when I started writing a blog, that was totally my thing as well, write for myself. And if anyone else enjoys it, great. But at the very least, if you're writing for yourself, you're going to get something out of it. It's going to be you just feel good writing things and you learn as you go and everything like that. So I think
it's a very underrated thinking tool. I think that if you can't think clearly, you can't write clearly. So if you force yourself to write clearly, you clarify your thoughts. I can't tell you how much I've learned just by writing, like just sorting through ideas. And most of my stuff doesn't get published, right? I just delete it or store it away somewhere. But it doesn't matter because it helps me clarify my thinking. It's amazing. I wish everybody would, just spend a little time writing through, their strongly held opinions. And what you'll oftentimes think is that, what you'll discover is that what you think is crap, that it's really hard to logically support what you think is a truth when you sit down and kind of make your argument and try and make a case for something. So I encourage everyone to write more. By the way, the way you asked about my process for publishing these books, I blog my books. So my philosophy is that I want to get out my ideas to my readers. They subscribe through at nearandfar.com, as you mentioned earlier. And so by just putting out my ideas, I get so much great feedback, right? People telling me, oh, this is a bad idea, or did you see this study, or you need to think about this more. That type of feedback is priceless. And so when it does come time to compile what I've written, I've kind of had a pre-edited version just because I put it out there before. So I don't sit down to write a book. I blog my way over years with different ideas, and then I select from those blog posts kind of pillars of chapters in a book that I can then elaborate on.
Yeah, there's a couple elements in there that I think are interesting. One is what you mentioned about sort of writing as a means of thinking, which I think is totally true. And some people I think sort of think of writing as like, okay, you've done a lot of thinking and you sort of know what you want to say, and then you go and all you have to do is like get it down on paper and like do some editing or something like that. But I think it's much more similar to what you've said, where it's a very interactive process. You can go to the page without really having much of any idea what it's going to end up saying. And as you're writing, you sort of maybe have an idea of a topic, which even that may change, but it's very much of a sort of integrated process of thinking, writing, and then the output not only results in the output of writing, but sort of this completed perspective that you maybe didn't have as polished beforehand. And then sort of interestingly, similarly, you have on the book writing approach, it's not you have an idea for a book and you go and set out to write it. It's very much integrated with just the way that you're living, the way that you're thinking, the way that you're writing, you're blogging. And then eventually it's like, okay, there's enough sort of fodder there that we can go and compile this into a book, and we'll do some extra work, maybe some extra research or whatever it is. But you're already a good portion of the way there. So I think that sounds like a really interesting process for people who maybe, there's a lot of people with blogs who haven't written books, and maybe they would be surprised at how sort of they would be able to, maybe their book that they're thinking of writing one day is already 60% written. And
yeah, very much so. Yeah. I mean, I think that my experience is only with nonfiction writing, so I have no advice for people who write fiction. But for nonfiction, the best nonfiction writing always starts with a question, right? It's either how to do something or why is this way? It's because it's curiosity that makes you want to read something. And if you as a writer are not curious about that topic, it shows in the writing, right? If you already know the answer to the mystery, your writing is going to be pretty boring. So my favorite topics to work on are articles where I really sincerely start with a question, and I don't know the answer, but I'm going to hunt it down, right? Like I'm almost like an investigative journalist trying to figure out the answer to this question. They're really fun to write, and they're much more fun to read.
Totally. So I think that one interesting aspect that's sort of upstream of Indistractable is this concept that I've heard you talk about, which I've thought about myself, and I think is just super powerful to realize, which is that the challenge for most people is not knowing what to do, it's doing it. And so like the version that I've sort of thought to myself is like, I think people use the difficulty of quote unquote figuring something out as an excuse to not do the part that So for example, with fitness, everyone knows like exercising daily or 5 days a week or whatever it is, it's going to be beneficial for you, or eating vegetables is going to be beneficial for you. But you're like, you get caught up so much in the weeds of like, oh, which vegetables are best, or like what time do I need to eat, or what size do I need to make my meals or whatever. And then you just sort of don't actually do the parts that you definitely know would be helpful. And I think Indistractable is very much about, okay, whatever it is that you know or don't know, let's take like sort of the things that you most fundamentally know that you want to focus on, your relationships, the work that you care about, your health, etc., and just do the things that you know you want to do. And that will take you like a very long way. So I think an interesting way to maybe plug into the book with sort of another quote I heard from you is time management is pain management. And basically all that sort of goes on the premise that all behavior comes from this desire to escape discomfort. Can you sort of introduce what that means, why time management is pain management, how you came to that sort of short conclusion?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was trying to figure out why we get distracted, right? Why is it that despite knowing what to do, we don't do it? Which, by the way, is an ancient problem. Plato, the Greek philosopher, talked about this very same problem 2,500 years ago. He called it in the Greek akrasia, the tendency to do things that are against our better interests. And it's a really interesting philosophical question. Why is it that despite knowing what to do, we don't do it? Right? Like that is a central mystery of the human condition. We know that to exercise you have to eat right. Or sorry, to lose weight you have to exercise and eat right. We already know that. To be successful in your job, you have to do the hard work that other people don't want to do. We know if you want to have good relationships, you have to be fully present with people you love. We know this stuff, right? And if you don't know it, frankly, in this day and age, Google it. All the answers are right there at your disposal. The problem is not that we don't know what to do, it's that we don't know how to stop getting in our own way. That's the central problem of our time. And so by removing that distraction, by simply doing the things that you yourself said you want to do, that is how we become indistractable. That's how we live the kind of lives that we know we deserve. So knowing that is not a new problem, I think what I wanted to figure out is if we know that, right, not only what's the psychology behind why we get distracted, what's the psychology behind why we do anything and everything, right? Let's really start from first principles. What is the nature of human motivation? And most people will tell you that motivation is about carrots and sticks. We've all heard this trope, right? That motivation is about, rewards and punishments, carrots and sticks. And it turns out that neurologically speaking, that is not true. That neurologically speaking, we now know that all human behavior is spurred by one thing, and that is, as you said, the desire to escape discomfort. And so it's almost like in that scene in The Matrix. Remember the Matrix movie where Neo goes into that room and he sees the boy with that spoon bending, and do you remember the line?
Yeah.
The line is, "Imagine there is no spoon," right? Imagine there is no spoon. So in a way, if you think about it, when it comes to human motivation, I'll give you another Matrix-like moment. Consider that the carrot is the stick. The carrot is the stick, that all human motivation is seeded by a desire to escape discomfort. So there's the stick, the pain motivation, but even the desire to feel good, even craving reward, is itself psychologically destabilizing. We say love hurts. That's absolutely true, right? That the desire, the longing, the wanting, the craving, the hunger for some kind of pleasurable outcome is itself uncomfortable. So the carrot is the stick. There's only one thing that motivates all human behavior, and that is a desire to escape discomfort. So that therefore must mean if all human behavior is spurred by a desire to escape discomfort, that means that time management is nothing more than pain management. Money management is pain management. Weight management is pain management, because all human behavior is spurred by a desire to escape discomfort. Now, to some people, that sounds like a bummer, right? Like, oh man, it's all about pain. Well, that's actually super empowering, because what you realize is that the barrier between your present self and what you are physically capable of, right? Unless it violates the laws of physics, what you are capable of, the only thing in between that is feelings. That's it. I mean, think about it, right? What's the number one reason people don't accomplish their goals? Well, we're talking about goals that are physically possible, right? Now, I don't have a goal to fly like a bird, but goals that are actually achievable. Why don't people achieve their goals? The number one reason: they quit. That is the number one reason people don't achieve their goals. What's the number one reason people quit? The number one reason people quit is they don't feel like continuing, right? I know I need to exercise, but I don't feel like it today. I know I need to get up early and go on that walk, but I don't want to. I know I need to work on that big project. I need to study. I need to, work on that presentation. I need to make my phone calls, my sales calls, whatever the case might be. I don't want to. Right? So to me, that's incredibly empowering, because once you realize that it isn't some big existential barrier blocking you from getting what you want in life, it's just feelings, They're just emotions. They're just uncomfortable sensations that we have not been taught how to deal with, right? No, we never had a class on how to manage your emotions. Did you ever take such a class? I never took such a class. But it turns out that is the only barrier. So once you learn how to master your internal triggers, you are free from them being your master. Most people are enslaved by these sensations: boredom, uncertainty, fatigue, anxiety. Every time they feel these things, right? Like I used to, I would eat something. Or today, people will scroll something, or they'll search something, or they'll drink something, right? To take their mind off of that discomfort. And once you realize that simple fact that all distraction is nothing more than a desire to escape discomfort, because all human behavior is a desire to escape discomfort, to me, that's incredibly empowering, because you can find some very simple tools, have them ready in your toolkit. And whenever you experience that discomfort, now you don't have to escape it with distraction. You can actually utilize those internal triggers, those uncomfortable sensations, as rocket fuel to propel you towards traction.
Yeah, so I know this part is going to be somewhat repetitive. You probably talked about it a million times and it's in the book and everything, but it's so important that I think it's worth restating, which is sort of the fundamental strategies for mastering your internal triggers. So whether that's a feeling of boredom or stress or loneliness or whatever it might be, what are the fundamental principles for mastering those triggers?
Yeah, so there's a dozen different techniques you can use that I describe in the book, and you can even come up with your own. I think the most important thing is not the tactics, it's the strategy. Tactics are what you do, strategy is why you do it. So the most important thing I want to leave people with is this understanding of these four fundamental steps, these four fundamental strategies to becoming indistractable. So number one, master your internal triggers. We can talk about that more in a second. Step number two, make time for traction. That if you don't plan your day, somebody's going to plan it for you. We can talk more about how to do that as well. Number three is hack back the external triggers. And number four is prevent distraction with pacts. So those are the four fundamental strategies that anybody can use to become indistractable. Let's dive into internal triggers. I'll give you a couple of techniques. There's all kinds of things you can do. You can reimagine the task, reimagine your temperament. There's all kinds of things you can do in those buckets. I'll give you a few very practical techniques. One technique that I use almost every single day is called the 10-minute rule. The 10-minute rule says that when you feel that urge to get distracted, right, whether it's checking social media, whether it's eating that piece of chocolate cake if you're trying to lose weight, whether it's smoking that cigarette you're trying to quit, whatever the case might be, you can give in to that distraction. Okay, we know that abstinence tends to backfire, right? That when you tell yourself, no, don't do that, it elicits what we call psychological reactance. Psychological reactance is this gut feeling that we experience that tells us when our autonomy is threatened, when we are told what to do, we tend to rebel, right? Don't tell me what to do. So if your boss ever tried to micromanage you, or your mom ever told you to put on a coat because it's cold outside and you said, don't tell me what to do, that's reactance. And it turns out we can actually elicit psychological reactance even when we are telling ourselves what to do. So be very careful anytime someone says, abstinence is the way. Oftentimes that's not the right answer. Some cases it can be, right? If you can remove the external triggers altogether. So this is why they tell people in rehab, you have to change your friend network, you have to change your community because of you don't want to see those frequent triggers in your environment. But you can't do that with food. You can't do that with technology. These things will always be around us. So a much better strategy is to tell yourself, you're not saying no, you're saying not yet. Not yet. So when you experience that urge towards distraction, what I want you to try, what I do every day, and has worked really well for me, is I tell myself, hey, I can give into that distraction. Okay, I can check email, I can go on social media, I can have a piece of that chocolate cake, whatever it is I want to do, but not right now. I choose to do it in 10 minutes. You can wait 10 minutes for just about anything, right? So I will give in to that in just 10 minutes. Now, for those 10 minutes, my job is to do what's called surf the urge. Surfing the urge acknowledges that our sensations, that these urges, these internal triggers, they crest and then they subside. They don't last forever, but that's, of course, not how we experience them. We think in the moment, oh, I'm always going to feel this way. I'm always going to be bored. I'm always going to be stressed. I'm always going to be fatigued. That's never the case, that these sensations crest and then they subside. So your job is to surf that urge like a surfer on a surfboard. One technique that I use when I'm trying to surf the urge is to have a simple mantra. My mantra when I find myself, slipping away towards distraction is to stop and say, this is what it feels like to get better. This is what it feels like to get better. And just repeating that mantra a few times, that acknowledging that, hey, if something is difficult, that's a good thing. That's telling you that that's a rare skill, right? If it was easy, everyone would do it. So acknowledging that you're growing, you're getting better at something, and having those internal triggers, having that uncomfortable emotional state, that's part of the growth process. So that's terrific. And then what you will find is within those 10 minutes, 9 times out of 10, you'll get back to the task at hand. Okay. And what you're going to do over time by learning to surf the urge is that you're going to challenge yourself to go from the 10-minute rule to the 12-minute rules or the 15-minute rule. And you're proving to yourself, hey, wait a minute, I have agency here. I have control over this. And look, I don't have to be beholden to every ping, ding, or ring. I can wait a little while between when I'm going to give into these distractions. And so over time, you're proving to yourself that you are the master of these internal triggers and that they don't master you.
Yeah, I love the 10-minute rule. Obviously, people use it for like anger, for something, or not 10 minutes maybe, but like 10 breaths or something like this. Basically, delaying any immediate reaction tends to be helpful in a large number of sort of contexts. And I guess one question I have is, you learn to sort of control these internal triggers, or at the very least, maybe you don't reduce the number of them, but you are able to use them as fuel for traction, like you said, rather than, triggers to distraction. And one thing I want to mention is that I found super interesting from your work is that most people think that external triggers, like your notifications or whatever it might be, are responsible for the vast majority of distraction. But, what you were saying in the book was like actually 90% of it is internal, and it might surface in checking your Twitter or whatever it is, but the actual first trigger in the first place is not the notification from Twitter, but rather your feeling of boredom or your feeling of stress or whatever it might be. So when it comes to internal triggers, are you trying to sort of metaphorically delete the apps and turn off notifications and, internally? Or is it more so saying that, okay, these apps are pre-installed, like boredom, stress, whatever.
Mm.
And I'm just going to have to learn to live with them. Or is it sort of a combination of both, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so what you mentioned those time studies. So the external triggers, all the pings, dings, and rings in our environment, they can lead to distraction. That's what we tend to blame. But as you said, it's only 10% of our distractions. It turns out that 90% of the time that we check our devices, 90% is because of an internal trigger. So how many times a day are you checking your phone? Not because there was any kind of beep, buzz, or boop. It's because you felt like it, right? You're feeling bored, you're feeling lonely, you're feeling uncertain, you're feeling stressed, and you're using the device as a pacification as a pacifier, essentially, to take your mind off of that uncomfortable sensation. So what Indistractable people do is that they deal with that discomfort in a different way. Paulo Coelho had a wonderful quote. He said, "A mistake repeated more than once is a decision. A mistake repeated more than once is a decision." So the difference between a distractible person keeps getting distracted by the same things again and again. How many times can we get distracted by the same technology again and again before we say enough? I'm going to do something about it. An indistractable person realizes that there's only 3 reasons for every single distraction. Either it's an external trigger. Okay, there's strategies to hack back those external triggers, which I talk about in the book. Lots of easy things you can do. The other thing is an internal trigger. So what do you do with that uncomfortable emotional state? We all have them, right? We all have internal triggers. In fact, what I found is that studying high performers have just as many internal triggers as the rest of us, right? When you look at people at the top of their game in sports and business and the arts, they all have these internal triggers. In fact, many of them have really severe trauma. When you look at the lives of celebrities, Oprah Winfrey and whoever else, many of them have some real trauma in their lives. So they feel the internal triggers that we feel as well: stress, anxiety, loneliness. They feel it too. The difference is that these high performers, they use that discomfort. They use those stories to propel them towards traction rather than what many people do, distractible people, trying to escape that discomfort with distraction. So every distraction either is caused by an external trigger, an internal trigger, or a planning problem. And so an indistractable person, when they get distracted, and say, okay, you got me once. All right, now what caused that distraction? An internal trigger, an external trigger, or a planning problem? And how can I take steps today to prevent getting distracted again tomorrow? And if you do that, if you use forethought, there is no distraction that we can't overcome. Nothing out there is so habit forming that we can't make sure that we can't prevent getting distracted from, as long as we take steps today. So a distractible person keeps getting distracted again and again, whereas an indistractable person says, okay, I'm going to make sure I take steps today with forethought so that that distraction doesn't happen again in the future.
Right. And I think this is probably the most important part for most people, myself included, is learning how to master these internal triggers, because it's the part that is probably gets less attention than the external triggers. And like you said, is responsible for the vast majority of the actual overall triggers. That said, I think it would be interesting, just given your experience and expertise, to talk about the external triggers just a little bit. I think
Sure.
two of the sort of main culprits in my experience are the phone and food, and these affect sort of phone affects sort of work, and then food affects sort of health. And so for me, like, two of my personal most impactful strategies have been on food, just being very mindful around what food I keep in the house and even where I keep it in the house. So not keeping a bunch of food on the counter, just having it away in cabinets in the fridge makes it like sort of, so I'm not seeing it all the time. And then secondarily, part of the work is in the grocery store, not picking a bunch of junk, not going to the grocery store hungry to help you not pick a bunch of junk, and things like that. And then on the
Yeah.
phone side, turning off the vast majority, if not all, notifications. For a while, I don't have it right now, but I have my phone on black and white mode, which was just sort of like helpful to making it a little less pleasant and whatever. But more recently, I got this great tip from my friend George Mack, who does this 2 phone strategy where he has one phone with, like, Twitter and Instagram and whatever else, there is on sort of like the most addicting apps, habit forming apps in the world. And then, and again, apps that you can totally use for great things, but apps that are very difficult to sort of not want to check all the time. And then another phone with, he calls it sort of like I think he calls it the Kale app and the dopamine app or something like that. And the Kale
Mm-hmm.
app, there's like nothing really that fun to do. And so you sort of, even if it's in your pocket or whatever all day, like there's not that, you check it, you don't really get that reward. This goes back to your book, Hooked, of course, much more so than Indistractable. But the two phone strategy has been very helpful for me. And you sort of reserve these times where you allow yourself to go on the dopamine phone and you have fun and you do whatever you want, but it's not in your pocket all the time, always tempting you, etc. Are there other sort of key practices that you've done yourself or that you've heard from others that are in this realm,
Yeah.
whether it's phone related, food related, or otherwise?
Yeah, there's lots of things you can do for external triggers, and you mentioned some of them. And frankly, I don't spend a lot of time in Indistractable on how to turn your phone into an Indistractable phone. I spend about like a page and a half on it because a lot of it's really simple stuff. Change your notification settings, use the Google Wellbeing or the Apple Screen Time features. I mean, these products come built in with ways to restrict use. So use the tools; they're right there. One of my favorite tools is Do Not Disturb while driving. Amazing, right? Like when you're trying to focus, you just push Do Not Disturb while driving, and if anybody calls you or texts you, they get a message that says you can customize it. Mine is customized. It says I'm indistractable right now. If this is urgent, text me the word urgent and your call will come through. It's an amazing technique. It works like a charm. So the technology is all there. We just have to use it. So there's a list of, checklist of different things you can do. I think the type of stuff that's less discussed and more important is how to master other internal triggers, right? Meetings. How many external triggers do we have for meetings that are completely pointless, right? How many emails do we get, which are just a complete waste of time? So a large part of the book is dedicated to these external triggers we don't talk about, which actually can take us off track as well. Not so much on the phone, because there's a lot of techniques you can use out there. I think that's kind of a little bit kindergarten stuff. You can find these tips and tricks. It's much more important to figure out these other things. Kids, right? Like I'm a dad. Kids are wonderful, but they can be incredibly distracting. What do you do then? So I go through each one of these potential external triggers. I will back up for just a second. There's one step we skipped. So step number 1 is master internal triggers. Step number 2 is making time for traction. And then step number 3 is hacking back the external triggers. And step number 2 is not to be skipped, because what we find, one of the best things you can do is if you have these things which you find are distractions, you can turn them into traction. How do you do that? You schedule them. So one of the best things that you can do, if you find that you spend too much time on Twitter, I want you to put in your calendar time for Twitter, right? Video games or YouTube or whatever it is that you think right now is a distraction. Watch the miracle that happens when you literally schedule that time. And I advocate that people do this for their entire day. It's called timeboxing. It is the most well-studied technique. It blows to-do lists out of the water. It is so much more effective than to-do lists, which is kind of the technique that most people use. And to-do lists can be actively harmful for your personal productivity. Whereas having a time box calendar, what you're doing by setting aside the time to say, hey, I am going to turn this distraction into traction by planning time for it. Now your brain doesn't have to think about it all day. Now you're not saying, oh, I wonder when I'm going to get time for Twitter. Oh, I know my social media time is on my schedule, 7 p.m. after dinner. That's my hour or hour and a half, whatever I've set aside in advance for that time. And the beauty is you can enjoy it without guilt, right? Because anything that is not what you put in your calendar is a distraction. So if you're doing anything but the thing you said you were going to do, even if it's playing video games or going on social media, now you're distracted from the thing you said you were going to do. So anything that's planned for is traction. Anything else is distraction.
Yeah, it's I'm a big believer in time boxing myself. I don't do like full day time boxes, and that's sort of, well, not often at least. And that's maybe the last thing that I'd like to talk about. But before that, just wanted to say that, because you didn't go deep into the to-do list comment there, but one of the things that very strongly resonated with me that you've said is to-do lists are actually counterproductive, not even just like not good, but actually like counterproductive in that basically this is something I had experienced myself, which you talk about, which is like you make a to-do list, you by their nature, like you never finish the to-do list. It just grows and grows and grows. And every day you sort of end the day with a bunch of things left on your to-do list, feeling like a failure. And it feels much better to sort of, whether it's time boxing or some other strategy you might come up with yourself, setting a day that is achievable and, not impossible, but also not a layup. And every day you can go out and sort of crush what you want to do. And it's much different mindset.
Just to clarify, there's nothing wrong with getting things out of your brain and onto a piece of paper or to an app. That's wonderful. But that's where people stop. right? They just write them down. And as you said, there's this never ending list. There's no constraint. You can always add things to a to-do list. And then you don't finish all those things and you feel terrible. And then you start reinforcing your mindset as someone who doesn't have good time management skills. And you think you're the problem. You're not the problem. It's a stupid technique that we've all been told to use. That's the problem. So what you have to do immediately after you put those things on a piece of paper is to get them in your schedule, right? To put them in your calendar, which will force you to make trade-offs. Right? A time box calendar, we all have 24 hours in a day. It forces you to make trade-offs and say, what's more important, this or that? So by doing it, that is that critical process, which what that also requires, and this is super important, is that we have to change our metrics of success. We are so infatuated with checking off cute little boxes. We've been so indoctrinated with this bullshit to-do list method that, I've known people who will literally write out things that they just accomplished just for the joy of checking them off, right? How silly is that? We do that because we've been indoctrinated to think that like success is checking off boxes. That is a silly metric. The right metric of success has nothing to do with finishing the task. Nothing to do with finishing the task. The right metric of success for that time box is this question: did I do what I said I was going to do for as long as I said I would without distraction? That is the only metric of success. And that can be done if you've scheduled time to go on Twitter. That can be done if you've scheduled time to edit a podcast or to do a sales presentation or whatever it is that you didn't want to do that you find you're constantly distracted from. If you simply measure yourself, not by whether you finished, but did you work on that task for as long as you said you would without distraction? Here's the kicker. People who do this finish more. They actually get more done than the to-do list people. Why? Because now there's a feedback loop. What happens when you use the to-do list is you work on a task for 5 minutes and then, oh, let me just check email for a minute, or, oh, I need to do that other thing real quick, or let me just check this. And you have no idea how long stuff takes you. On average, we know that people think a task takes a third as long as it actually does. It takes 3 times longer on average for people to finish a task than they originally estimate. With a time box calendar, now you have a feedback system, right? Because you work on a task, you say 30 minutes without distraction. How much did I get done? Oh, I have to do 30 slides, and in 30 minutes, I finished 3. Okay, well, that means that I need 10 more time blocks of 30 minutes to finish the entire presentation. Now you have a feedback loop. So this is another reason why time box calendars and becoming Indistractable are way better than the to-do list method.
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. I know we're coming up on time, but I have one more question, which is
Sure.
maybe a difficult one. I'm not sure how much you've thought about this particular thing, but with this time box schedule, basically, well, let me set some context. There's this quote from Naval Ravikant, which is like, inspiration is perishable, act immediately. And that's something that resonates quite strongly with me. Some of my best blog posts, for example, among other work, have come from like, oh, I'm out for a walk. I have this idea. It feels like sort of a very inspired idea, like sort of hits you strongly. There's like an emotional thing to it or whatever. And I'm like, I got to go work on that now. Because if I don't do it now, that feeling sort of fades away and it just ends up on a to-do list somewhere and it becomes a chore rather than something that I want to do. And so one of the things that I've struggled with time boxing is that balance between here's what I set out to do today, but what if something comes up during the course of the day that feels like actually, the information has changed. There's a new thing that I want to do today. Do you sort of allow some flexibility for like, hey, this is what I set out to do. This thing arose, but it's actually, call it a distraction, call it whatever you want, but it's like very inspired. I really want to work on it. Do you have some flexibility in the time boxing for sort of adding things like this that are, very valuable changes to your daily schedule after it's been defined?
Yeah, it's a very common and good question. That is typically a trap. It's typically a trap. I'll give you an exception, but it's typically a trap because ideas are cheap, right? You know how many people out there have good ideas? Everybody has good ideas. You know what's scarce? Execution, getting the shit done. That's way more scarce than the idea. So I'm going to introduce you to a very powerful technology that I have with me at all times. Whenever inspiration strikes, here it is. Okay. Wherever I go, I have a pen and I have a little piece of paper. And whenever I have an idea or a concern or a worry, I write it down and I get back to the scheduled task. Okay. Because what tends to happen is if you are always at the whim of, oh, that's a good idea, or I should worry about this, or I should think about that, or I should do this, you never get to the actual execution. You have a bunch of blog posts, ideas, and you never finish the fucking blog post because you have to sit down and make sure you can work on it without distraction in order to get it done. So if I do have an idea that I think, oh, that's a really good thought, no problem. I jot it down, and then I have time scheduled later in the day to think about those things. Okay. So what you could do, right, is to schedule a big period of time. Maybe it's 3-4 hours, however much time you want in your day, to let your mind wander, to be spontaneous. You can plan spontaneity, but you also need to make sure that when the rubber hits the road, and if you're a pro, right, Stephen Pressfield talks about this in his book, The War of Art. If a turning pro means that you put your butt in the chair and finish the work and do it. And so as long as you can do both, I don't have a problem with that. If you want time for loosey-goosey, let inspiration strike and I'll do whatever time, great, you can schedule it. As long as you can also schedule that time for, hey, I'm going to work on this project that's difficult for as long as I said I will without distraction. You need to be able to do both.
Great. Well, I think I need to schedule a little bit of time to think that through a little bit. It's an interesting perspective, and I think it's a nuanced issue, but I think there's definitely a lot of value to that perspective on it. So anyway, I know we're up on time. I appreciate you taking the time and coming on the show. It's been awesome talking with you. Where can people go? You know, obviously nirandfar.com. That's NIR and far, like your name. Where else can people go to sort of follow along and keep in touch with what you're doing?
Yeah, that's the best place to go, to my blog, nirandfar.com. And the books are Hooked, How to Build Habit-Forming Products, and Indistractable, How to Control Your Attention and Choose Your Life.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Nir.
Thanks so much, Jake. Good talking to you.